This week we're checking out a brand new airbrush from Harder & Steenbeck. This is the Evolution CR Plus 2024. I was actually very excited when they announced this upgraded model because I've been a huge fan of the brand for many years and I own most of their airbrushes. A few months ago, I also purchased the new Ultra model, which I was really impressed with because the control was so good. And I was very happy to see that a lot of that control was also brought over to this model. So I reached out to Warwick from Harder & Steenbeck, who by the way is doing a phenomenal job on their YouTube channel. It's one that's just loaded with information and tips each week and just awesome work all around. And he mentioned to me that he'd recommend checking out the 2-in-1 model, which comes with both a 0.28 and a 0.45 setup. So that was the one that was sent out to me, but just like every other airbrush that I paint with and review on this channel, I paid full price for this airbrush. So I paid $263 for the 2-in-1 model, and the reason that I purchase every airbrush that I review is just to keep them independent and to remain a painter and a customer like I've always been. So just like every other review, we'll start with the objective things, and then I'll get into my subjective preferences, things that I like and things that I don't. When you buy the Evolution 2024, it comes in this nice and standard Harder & Steenbeck plastic box. Inside the box, the first thing that you're going to notice here is a spray test of your particular airbrush. I love this when they pre-test the airbrush before they send it out. I think it's a very important thing, especially for higher end brands like Harder & Steenbeck. And because I purchased the 2-in-1, not only do I get the airbrush in here, but I also get the larger size of the needle, the nozzle, and a larger cup. So right out of the box, this model comes equipped with a 0.28mm needle and nozzle and a 2mm paint cup. And this one also includes the larger paint cup, which is 5 milliliters, and the larger and needle nozzle size at 0.45. You can see the difference in the sizes right here. Both of them are very well made and they screw on to the body of the airbrush. Now, I'm a huge fan of removable paint cups, and as far as I know, I think Harder & Steenbeck was the first brand to do this. They're definitely the first one that I've owned that had a removable cup. Don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure, but I know back when I bought the Infinity, it came with a removable cup and I just loved it back then, and it's just something I like on my airbrushes. So after like a decade or so of painting and cleaning, it's just very nice to have that option to replace your cup with a shiny brand new one. It's not needed, but it's something that I really like and prefer. With the larger 5mm cup attached like you're seeing here, it does feel a bit tight for me. My finger feels a little bit cramped, but again, because it's removable, I much prefer painting with the smaller cup. More options is always a good thing. And with the smaller cup connected, I just get a lot more room for my trigger finger and it feels more comfortable. And subjectively, I think the trigger design is excellent. It's extremely smooth and precise, and I think the upgrade to a larger trigger pad was a great addition because it just makes me feel like my trigger finger is just locked in there. It's much larger than the older trigger and has a slight concave, almost scalloped design with some notches cut out in it. I found that my trigger finger rests perfectly within this groove, and the trigger feel itself is just as smooth as you could possibly get. No sort of grittiness, no sort of graininess when you press down and pull back for paint. And this model works just like any traditional airbrush, down for air, back for paint. It doesn't have that feature which was designed for beginners in the Ultra 2024 model where you can't pull back without pressing down for air first. And the finishing on this new Evolution is flawless, just as I expected from any other Harder & Steenbeck airbrush. Underneath the macro lens, the finish speaks for itself, just perfect construction with zero imperfections. I've already put a lot of time in with this airbrush, so it may not look as clean as it comes out of the box, but it's a tool and that's what it's designed for. And just like all their other models, yeah, they may be beautiful airbrushes, but they're also very tough. They're designed to be used and painted with for many, many years. The needle and nozzle are also perfectly centered within the front of the airbrush, which is obviously very important. And one thing that I really like about this new air cap design is that it has different notches on it so you can differentiate the different sizes. You can see the 2 rings cut out here, which indicates that this is used for the 0.28mm needle and nozzle set. And this cap here also has these nice cutouts, so it gives you plenty of grip when you need to unscrew this to clean out the nozzle or to swap it out with a different one. On the back of the rear handle, you have a cutout here so you can access the needle chucking nut if you want to press down and flush out any paint. But you can get pretty much the same effect by just pressing down and pulling back on the trigger to flush out a clog while you're painting. And then on the back here, you have a needle limiter. You can set this to a certain point so that you can't pull too far back on the airbrush trigger. It's a very cool design with these threads. I just turn it a very small amount and it moves that screw forward. Now, this is a very cool thing, but for me personally, it's something that I never use, but I think it's very helpful for new painters just to prevent yourself from spraying too much paint. It's a simple feature, but could be a great thing for new painters just to give yourself a little bit more confidence. In my hand, the airbrush feels very nice. This is definitely a subjective thing. I feel like you sit a little bit farther back on this one than some other airbrushes. But one thing that I have to say is that this new trigger pad is just so comfortable compared to the old one. I actually really like the old one. I thought it was pretty comfortable. I know some people said it was a little bit too sharp, but this one just feels a little bit nicer because it's thicker and it's wider and my finger just fits into it very, very well. We will, of course, get to some painting tests next, but let's quickly break down this airbrush so that you can see the internal parts. The first thing I'm going to do is unscrew this rear handle, which has some nice threads to it. It feels very smooth coming off the airbrush. Then I'll unscrew this chucking nut and remove the needle out the back of the airbrush. You'll notice on these newer Harder & STEENBECK needles, they have some notches cut out on the back. They updated this a while ago, but I just found this to be a huge upgrade from the ones that I was using over a decade ago. With their older needles, there were no notches to distinguish what size you were using, so it was kind of difficult to keep track of everything. So this one has the 2 notches on it, indicating that this is their new 0.28 millimeter needle. From here, I'm going to unscrew this needle chucking nut, which is, I think, the nicest one that I've seen from any airbrush brand. And then I can grab the middle component here, which acts as the spring housing, and unscrew it from the back of the airbrush. It has some very deep notches in it, giving me some good grip on it, so I really doubt that I'm ever going to need soft jaw pliers to remove this. And then inside here, you have the needle spring and the needle chuck, which slide right out of this housing. So it's very, very easy to take apart the rear assembly of this airbrush. It's 3 parts, it comes off in a matter of seconds. On Harder & STEENBECK's website, they call this the trigger cam control, saying that it's redesigned to create the perfect connection between your finger and the needle motion. One thing I found interesting on their website, they said that our unique X-Center now behaves like a true cam system, as accurate and tunable as in a performance engine. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm all for it. All I know is that as I was painting with this airbrush, I did find it to be very responsive, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can clearly see the difference in the design here from the previous generation evolution. The new version is on the left and the older one is on the right. And you can see on the newer one that it's a little bit shorter, a little bit tighter up in the front. My guess is that this was redesigned to just pick up some of that slack to make the trigger feel more responsive. And speaking of the airbrush trigger, once the needle and the rear assembly is removed, this lifts right out of the top of the airbrush. You'll notice that the trigger lever is connected to the back of this, and it has a small ball at the bottom to press down on the air valve assembly below it. The cup on the airbrush right now is the smaller one. It's the 2 mil cup, and both of them come with these very nicely machined caps, which just fit on top through compression. And as I stated before, these are removable paint cups. You could just unscrew it right from the body of the airbrush, and inside there is a small Teflon ring to prevent any paint from leaking out. Up in the front is the air cap with these really deep notches on it to give yourself some good grip. And when you unscrew this, you need to be careful because the nozzle is self-centered floating in there, and this cap is what holds it in place. It's a large and well-machined nozzle, very easy to take apart and clean. Larger self-centering nozzles like this are easily my favorite because they're just so easy to maintain the airbrush. You're eventually going to need to break this down and clean it, and it just makes it a breeze. That's as far as I'm going to break down this airbrush. There is, of course, the needle packing screw inside the body of the airbrush and the air valve assembly at the bottom, but there's no real reason to ever take those apart, so I'm not going to in this video. To reassemble the airbrush, you just place the nozzle within that air cap and then screw it on to the airbrush. Very important, you want to keep everything hand tight on an airbrush. You never want to over tighten anything. Once that's done, I'll take the trigger and then just drop it into the top of the airbrush. You'll know that it's in correctly when you feel the spring below it pressing up on it. And just make sure that trigger lever behind the trigger drops down into place. And then I'll take that needle chuck, place the needle spring right over the back of it, and then insert this entire assembly into that middle component, which is going to act as the housing. Then from here, I'll screw this into the back of the airbrush, again, just hand tight, making sure that I can feel the trigger pulling back correctly. The only thing that I'm not crazy about on this model, and it was the same with the older Evolution, is that you can adjust the spring tension. There's no adjustment screw on the back here to make that trigger feel softer or heavier. It's designed to feel the way that they set it in the factory, and there's no adjustments. Now, this is just my preference, but I prefer a much heavier trigger on an airbrush, so I do wish there was an option to tighten this down to give myself some more tension. And then I'll take the needle chucking nut, place it on the back, insert the needle, and tighten it down. And then once I screw back on the cap and the rear handle, this airbrush is fully reassembled and you're ready to paint with it. Now, breaking down an airbrush is not something that you're going to need to do right away, but later down the road you will. You will have to clean it to maintain it. And honestly, I think that this model along with the Ultra 24 are some of the easiest airbrushes to take apart that I've ever used. When you take apart a Harder & Steenbeck, you always see that everything is so nicely made and machined. And I know I keep talking about the build's quality, but that's always been my favorite thing about Harder & Steenbeck. They make some of the nicest airbrushes on the planet. So no surprises with this one, just very nice to see. One thing that I want to mention is that both of these air caps come with these 2-prong needle protecting tips, and they're just held in by compression. They press on to the air cap, and what's nice about them is that you have very easy access to your needle while it's still protected. And while you're painting, as tip dry starts to build up, you could just clean it off with your fingers, a cotton swab, or a brush. For me personally, I remove all of these from every single airbrush I have because I want very easy access to the needle. But if you're just starting out or in your first year or so of using an airbrush, I highly recommend leaving this on just to prevent any damage. I've been working pretty hard on this painting over the last few weeks. I was using a bunch of different airbrushes and I still got a long way to go. And of course, I was testing out the Evolution 24 during this painting throughout different sessions using both the 0.28 and the 0.45. The reason that I like doing this is just to see how well the airbrush performs in practice when you're actually using it for the job that you purchased it for. And for this part where I'm using it to add in a few glazes of transparent paint, I think it did an excellent job. For this part, I'm using the 0.28. I think it did an amazing job at atomizing the paint, giving a very soft, smooth transitions between blends. And I also found that it gives a very high amount of detail for a 0.28. It's a little bit larger than their original design, which was a 0.2. And to be honest, it sprays like a true detail airbrush. It sprays like a 0.2 or a 0.18. Just a very tight spray pattern, a very tight cone, so you don't have to be really close to get that detail and to get those subtle blends. I also found that the 0.28 is pretty unforgiving with thicker paints, meaning that you need to be using a high quality paint in order for this airbrush to perform the way it's designed to. And just like all detail airbrushes, it's going to be prone to clogging if you're not using a high quality airbrush paint. A nice surprise is that the 0.28 also has a pretty nice low airspeed, so you don't feel that turbulence blowing off your artwork as you're painting. And it kind of reminds me of a Micron or a PS771 where when you press down on the airbrush trigger, you don't just feel a huge gust of air. It just feels soft, controlled, and very comfortable to paint with. It does spray pretty differently than those type of airbrushes. It has a much larger nozzle and a very different design. But in my opinion, the 0.28 sprays and performs just like any detail airbrush. I found that the 0.45 was way more forgiving. I was spraying paint right out of the bottle. No issues at all, not a single clog. It also has a higher airspeed and puts out a good amount of paint compared to the 0.28. And I just found that it holds up to that name 2-in-1 because it really feels like two different airbrushes. 0.28 for detail, tight controlled lines and spray patterns. And then if you want to spray some thicker paint, stuff right out of the bottle, or you want a wider spray pattern where you're just putting down a lot more paint, you switch over to the 0.45 and it feels like a different airbrush. I'm using the 0.28 here just to test out some letters where I'm starting and stopping the airbrush over and over to see how the response rate is, and it's doing a very good job. It's very comfortable and it's starting and stopping exactly where I want it to be instantly. And even if I try to spray in tiny, like microscopic letters, it's still doing a very, very good job. So no complaints at all with this. And to be fair, this is difficult for any airbrush to do because it really tests that precision of how precise that trigger is. So I switched over to some over-reduced paint, this Createx Illustration colors, and I'm spraying right at around 20 psi. Checking the response rate, look at my trigger finger. You can see it's barely moving, exactly what I want to see. Very, very pleased with this. For painting fine lines, this airbrush is excellent. I could spray a line thinner than a human hair. But to be fair, I could do this with pretty much any airbrush 0.5 or smaller. The trick is just holding it right off the surface you're painting, reducing your paint, and dropping your PSI. For this part, I switched over to the 0.45 with the same paint, spraying at around 25 psi. The 0.45 is very, very responsive. I feel like it's more responsive and more forgiving than the smaller 0.28. And the reason for that is simple. Paint is obviously made up of paint particles, so the wider the opening of the nozzle, the more forgiving it is and the less prone it's going to be to clogs. And then for painting fine lines, I can get a line just as thin as the 0.28. The reason I can get it just as thin is because I'm holding it right off the surface. But this 0.45 does put down a lot more paint than the 0.28, so you got to be careful not to pull too far back on the trigger or it's going to really flood that paint out. The last thing I want to do is show the airspeed of this airbrush and compare it with a few Iwatas just to show you what it's like. I'm going to change this up a little bit. Instead of using an anemometer, I'm just going to show you the sound holding the airbrushes at the same distance, spraying at 30 psi. I'll first start out with the Iwata Revolution spraying at 30 psi, and then I'll switch over to an Iwata Micron spraying at the exact same psi. So you should be able to hear the different air speeds between these different airbrushes. So hopefully you were able to hear the differences there, how much higher the airspeed is in an airbrush like the Iwata Revolution and the 0.45 Evolution, and how much lower the airspeed is on the Iwata Micron and on the 0.28 Evolution. And I'm not sure if that's helpful for anyone, but that's something that I'm always interested in the airbrushes that I purchased, so hopefully it helps some of you. And that's going to be it for this review. As you could tell, I was very impressed with this. It's another great addition to the Harder and STEENBECK lineup. Very happy to own it, add it to the collection, and I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun to paint with over the years. And I do hope that this video is helpful for some of you out there who are considering this airbrush. This video is much longer than I expected it to be, so that's where I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week.